Hello, AP Research students. In this video, I will be guiding you through the process of writing Section 2. Section 2 is titled Method, Process, or Approach. There are a few things that we need to clarify before moving forward. These terms in research, methodology and methods, are often used interchangeably and sometimes confuse people. Methodology is the overall framework that will guide your research. This means all the different elements that make up your research section fall under the title of methodology. If you are choosing to conduct a phenomenology and you want to conduct interviews, then a study of all of that process is your methodology versus your methods, which are the actual tools that you will use to carry out your research. Section 2 is not going to be titled methodology, but it's going to be titled methods. And here's what we're really asking for in Section 2. In Section 2, you will need to explain and provide justification for your chosen method, process, or approach. This is exactly what you're asked to do, and therefore you should show how you are fulfilling these requirements in the following ways. What should you write about? You should be able to, in Section 2, explain the limitations of your research and justify the choices you make during your inquiry process. This demonstrates that you have command over your research. In other words, that you know what you're talking about. In Section 2, you will also need to elaborate on the reasons or the rationale for your proposed research design. And this should justify how appropriate your research is to the purpose of your study. So you're not simply telling us which research design you're using or what approach or what methods you're using or what data collection tools you're using, but you need to explain it. So you are defending a rationale. You also need to discuss perhaps why the selected method was chosen instead of any other. So for example, if you wanted to conduct quantitative research, then you should justify why you didn't choose qualitative research. Or if you wanted to use interviews, you should justify why you perhaps didn't use focus groups. This is going beyond just stating what you're doing, but also explaining for what you're not doing as a means to express how well you understand the whole research and inquiry process. And lastly, you're asked to elaborate as to why the design that you're proposing will accomplish the goals of your own research and why the choices you're making fulfill the specific requirements for your own research. So what are limitations? Limitations are influences that the researcher cannot control. They're shortcomings, conditions, or influences that place restrictions on your methodology and conclusions. Last year, and even this year, COVID-19 presented great limitations for students' research. Any limitation that might influence the results should be mentioned in this section. When considering what limitations there might be in your investigation, be very, very thorough and consider the following: limitations to your analysis. So were there shortcomings in terms of how well you were able to analyze the information? Some research requires specific software that you might or might not have access to. The nature of self-reporting, in this case, some results may be skewed. How do you really know that people are answering truthfully or honestly? The instruments that you utilized, perhaps there is some level of bias in the instrument, or perhaps the instrument could have been presented otherwise, or maybe you used a tool that wasn't the optimal tool for your research. Limitations also in terms of the sample that you have and or the sample size. So who are the participants that you're reaching out to? Were you able to get as many as you need to? Maybe there are limitations. Last year, a student was doing research on solitary confinement in prisons. Accessing people who had been in prison was a limitation. Time constraints are also limitations. So you need to make sure that you're planning enough time for your research, but also understand that some research might naturally need more time than you have available. So what do expectations of limitations look like in Section 2? In order to write about this in section 2, you'll need to identify only the limitations that have the greatest impact on A, the quality of your findings, and B, your ability to effectively answer your research questions and/or hypotheses. For example, we know that when adopting a quantitative research design, a failure to use random sampling technique limits your ability to make broader generalizations from our results, i.e., our ability to make statistical inferences from our sample to population being studied. Therefore, if you're not randomly sampling your participants, you might not be able to make generalized conclusions. Limitations can also include discussing whether or not participants answered the questions truthfully, whether or not you got enough participants for your sample size, or whether or not your data collection instrument or method worked well. Excuses are not limitations. Students might think that offering an excuse for why the research design did not get implemented as planned, or why they did not choose a better, more aligned research design is an explanation of their design or conclusions. For example, I'm only a high school student and could not implement the method that I know would be most aligned to the purpose of my inquiry. Or, my results were probably skewed because I didn't hand out my survey until about a month ago, so hardly anyone responded. In other words, you want to make sure that the limitations you are expressing in section 2 are aligned to the significance of your research question. If they're just excuses, they're not going to cut it. So let's take a look at some examples. We have 2 examples here from previous AP research students. Example 1 is the effects of romantic relationships on the academic performance of 12th graders in Dakar. And example 2, the impact of globalization on culture in Senegal. So for example 1, I'm just going to scroll through until section 2. So here we are, section 2, the methodology or methods section. Let me zoom this in so that it's easier to look at. All right, so you can see here the students section 2, and it reads out, research design. I implemented the simple descriptive and exploratory design. This design used survey questionnaires that were distributed to the 12th graders specifically in order to attain the main objective of the study, which is to examine the effects of romantic relationships on 12th graders' academic performance in Dakar. The research itself tried to describe, analyze, and interpret the status of students. The design is non-experimental case study correlation research. This design investigated the relationship between the variables without manipulating them. The 2 main variables evaluated were academic performance and romantic relationship, which involves time management and levels of motivation. This is an example of the scope of the research being clearly elaborated right from the start. The student then went on to discuss the participants and the location of the study. So this study was conducted online using constructed surveys for 12th graders in Dakar during the first, second, and third trimesters of the 2019 to 2020 academic year, regardless of gender and the type of high school in Dakar. There were 30 respondents who took part in the study, and the population consisted of 12th graders in Dakar who participated on a strictly voluntary basis. In terms of sampling, the researcher made use of selective sampling method in the selection of 12th graders, since the study focused on this particular group. 12th graders during the 2019 to 2020 academic year became the participants of the study. There were only 13 students who met the criteria of being in romantic relationships, but there were 30 students overall who responded to the survey. In terms of data collection, the gathering of data for this study utilized a self-administered descriptive questionnaire because it economizes time and effort, and it has the ability to maintain confidentiality. The participants will be requested to voluntarily fill out a survey questionnaire online to provide the necessary data in the study. After gathering this data, the researcher will group the responses according to the subproblems of the study. Instrumentation. In order to answer specific subproblems in the study, survey questionnaires were distributed to 12th graders. Interviews with some students would also be conducted to confirm the results of the survey. The survey questionnaires will consist of a broad range of questions aimed at gauging the students' involvement in romantic relationships and their adverse effects on academic achievement. Each questionnaire will have 3 parts. The first part will regard the profile of respondents, such as demographic information. The second part will comprise of the status of time management of students, and the third and fourth parts will consider the levels of motivation of students and as 12th graders in Dakar. The 2 last parts are in a Likert scale form, which respondents will be asked to indicate whether they strongly agree, are undecided about, disagree, or strongly disagree in the given statements. Statistical treatment of data. Since this is a correlation study, the data will be collected and converted to a percentage and will be presented in tabular and graphical forms for interpretation. And this is the formula that the students used. So this example shows really well how the student explained the scope of the research and justified some of the choices for the research. And so let's look at a second example. In this student, so on the impact of globalization on culture in Senegal, let's skip to section 2. And section 2 actually starts here. So this one is not as clearly delineated, oh, whatever the word is. So section 2 actually starts here. So after the introduction and literature review section, this student starts with hypothesis. So it reads, after enough research and brief analysis of the situation around me, my hypothesis is that the culture is negatively impacted in urban areas, but not in rural areas because the globalization process is not developed in those areas quite yet. I base my hypothesis on the fact that most Senegalese people living in rural areas do not have access to the internet. So my project goal is to, as long as globalization is fastened by the internet and technologies, by bringing people together, they're left over. We also have to say that these are not the same in all parts of Senegal, but mostly everywhere. Method. In order to test my hypothesis, I decided to conduct a descriptive research. I've considered a case study, but that would be somehow seeking for more than I need because my project is to know whether or not the culture is being negatively impacted by globalization. And with a descriptive method, I will have the general overview of situation and so valuable answer. I'll use a quantitative method because it will allow me, as mentioned before, to have a large view on the topic and so allow me to have the answers I'm seeking. Also, that is the logical method to be used in order to reach my project goal. Survey. My survey will be my only research tool because it will allow me to have a concrete data on large scale and to be able to have response that aligns with my research strategy or goal. In a more concrete way, my survey will be based on 4 elements of culture that I will use to track down if a change in culture is occurring or has occurred. The way that this student organized their survey is social organization, customs, language, and arts. I will not be reading all of these throughout, but the student does justify why they chose each of those sections. Actually, I think this might be helpful. So, social organization. The social organization is the way a group is hierarchized and composed. Cultural hierarchization in Africa would be typically dominated by men, and women would be the one that stay at home and raise kids. The society is heavily impacted by castes that are a big part of mating norms. So to go about that, I will ask the subject in the community that they live in is cultural or modernized or westernized, which means less stress the group aspect of things, but more individual aspect of things. So the question will allow me to know if that aspect or point of culture is still living or existing. In terms of customs basically are the habits, ceremonials, and other doings due to culture. Most of the Senegalese cultural customs are ceremonial because the doings and habits became so normal for us that it would be hard to dissociate them from normal behaviors. To know if the customs are gone or not, I'll ask people if they have cultural customs in their everyday behavior. They will have the choice to say yes, maybe, or no. Yes will mean that they're conscious of the act that they're doing and that those are part of cultural customs. Maybe will mean that they do not know what are cultural customs and what they're doing, but they think that some of their acts are cultural customs. And no will mean that they're sure that none of their acts are cultural customs. Thirdly, language. Language tools are used to communicate with other human beings that understand the same language as us. In Senegal, we have 36 local languages. Asking this question will allow me to know if local languages are subsisting in the invasion of Western language. In this question, I'll ask participants if they speak local languages. Yes will mean that even unconsciously they have a certain link with their culture. No one mean that they do not have a linguistic link with their culture. And fourthly, arts can be considered as a vast set of elements including music, dance, painting, tattoos. For this point, the question is to know if they know any traditional music or dance, and the answer will be basic yes or no. And like other questions, it will allow us to see people are linking their culture using music. A lot of people have a really special link with music, so some tribal or cultural music is biggest link to our culture. Okay, so from that you can see how the student explain in depth the different parts of the survey and what the types of responses would mean to how the student would analyze the research. And so I'm reading the last part. To conduct my research, I chose two places, one rural and one urban, to have a contrast and so to be able to answer my research question. The rural place is a place where I assume globalization is not quite developed. In fact, globalization axes itself on mass media communication and social media. And as long as Senegalese rural zones are not totally electrified, mass media is not impacting those zones as much. The urban areas are fully electrified and the internet is barely everywhere. And so the globalization process is really advanced. The place I chose as rural is Ngaparou, a small cultural village for the Lebu people that are an ethnic group that is known for being good fishermen because they live next to the ocean. The village in question does not tear apart. It is next to the ocean with a lot of canoes on the beach. The urban place chosen is Dakar, the urban places chosen in Dakar is Liberté 6, which is a neighborhood that is considered a melting pot. A lot of diversity in socioeconomic and ethnic fields with people from a lot of different places. Such diversity will allow having non-biased and valuable answers. So this is the students section 2. Back to our presentation. Oh, no, this student does a really good job at justifying like the rationale and explaining why they're considering particular methods versus others, and then also walking us through the instrument tool that they will be using in order to conduct their research and the choices behind those. So you've just looked at two examples of section two of AP research papers. Again, these might not be perfect, but they do hit on some of the key aspects of what section 2 should look like. So I invite you to look at these examples and look at other examples for inspiration and to use them as partial guides. You will also need to follow your own research methodology, be guided by your own research design approach and process in order to complete this. And remember that you need to do the following. A, explain the scope, boundaries, or limitations of your research and justify the choices you made during the inquiry process. This demonstrates that you command control over your own research. In other words, you're the expert of your research. B, you will need to elaborate on the rationale of your proposed research design's appropriateness to your study of purpose. So you're not simply listing and describing the research designs, you're also explaining why they're appropriate for your research. C, you need to discuss why the selected method was chosen instead of another. So why a quantitative approach was preferred over a qualitative approach. And D, elaborate on why the proposed design will accomplish your study goals and why your chosen design is the optimum choice for your research. So you have a new deadline for section 2. It'll now be due Sunday, March 28th. Again, there is no specific page number or word count for section 2. You can aim for 500 to 1,000 words as long as you address the key elements. Example 1 was relatively short, about 500 words, and example 2 was a little bit longer, around 900 words. So these are just 2 examples that hit on some of the key aspects of section 2. I invite you to look at other examples and to ask me if you have any questions. Thank you very much.